Germans, we must begin on time. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. And for those who are watching on the live stream, good afternoon to you. We'll be taking questions at the end, and we're going to leave a goodly amount of time for questions. So if you're watching on the live stream and you're interested in asking a question, probably the most efficient thing, if you tweet me at Lucy Marcus, and I'll keep a little eye on my Twitter stream so that I can see if we can address some of the questions that come over Twitter. So, welcome to the Reporting on the Refugee Crisis panel. We're delighted that you were able to join us here at what is my favorite event of every year at the International Journalism Festival. There are worse places to come than Perugia. We have three experts in their fields here, and we're going to begin with some questions and then open it up. So Stefan Wolf is an expert in ethnic conflict and post-conflict reconstruction and security and state security and all sorts of stuff. Andrew Sterlein is the EU Media Director for Human Rights Watch. And Georg von Habsburg is ambassador plenipotentiary for Hungary, but also an advisor to the International Red Cross. And so to kick us off, Stefan, I'd like you to talk a little bit about narratives around the refugee crisis, because I think one of the things that would be interesting to have a conversation about is how journalism shapes the perception of the refugee crisis, and also I want to hear from all of you what you think has been missing from that narrative, and you know, what are the other things that should be discussed. So Steph, let's start with you.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Is it on? Yes, now it's on. Okay. By way of introduction and as a caveat, I'm not a journalist, I'm an academic, so I follow media and I find media very useful as a source of information. So my observations are more on what media has been doing rather than an insider perspective. And I followed the situation in sort of what you might call the Greater Middle East or the New Middle East for quite some time, mostly from the perspective of the conflicts that were happening there. And then obviously the refugee crisis as it developed became a major focal point, both from the perspective of the impact and the consequences that it had, but also in terms of the various potential remedies and responses that states could have to that. So from that perspective, what I observed and found very interesting was how the narratives surrounding the refugees have changed over time. And initially, sort of probably for the first 2 or 2.5 years of the crisis in Syria, it was very much centered on the refugee crisis as a major humanitarian issue affecting in particular the region. I remember being in Jordan in late 2012 for a conference there, and one of the really striking things for me was not just the sheer scale of the displacement and the refugees that we had from the Syrian crisis, but also the potentially rather catastrophic impact that it had on Jordan. And one of the most striking aspects of that was that prior to the refugee crisis, Jordanian experts had estimated that the country had water reserves for about 70 years. And then over the evolution of the Syrian crisis, the population of Jordan basically increased by 50%. So you can imagine what that then means for the projection of how long a country's water will actually last. But by the same token, the way in which that was portrayed in Jordan was not really in the sense of, well, now all these refugees coming here and they're taking our water. But it was very much sort of, if you want, an accepting response. So people were actually willing and prepared to share whatever they had with the refugees in the reception. That certainly we have seen of refugees in Jordan, but also in the wider neighborhood, was initially certainly very much one that responded in particular to the humanitarian needs. So this first narrative surrounding refugees then was very much one that really concentrated on the sheer scale of the humanitarian disaster that the conflict in Syria inflicted upon Syrians. But then over time this gradually changed, and in particular as we saw sort of the crisis in Syria deepening the expansion of ISIS both in Syria and in Iraq, and the gradually increasing flow of refugees beyond the region, so that they didn't just stay in the camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey and so on. The more this narrative then for some reason, I mean for obvious reasons, became what sort of as an academic I would call securitized. So refugees suddenly became a security issue. And this narrative then was massively picked up, in particular by media organizations in the West, following a statement by the by NATO General Breedlove, who is the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, basically alleging that Russia was using refugees as a weapon to destabilize well, basically European Union and NATO member countries. Now then on top of that you had similar security-linked narratives that connected refugees from Syria to the potential of ISIS infiltrating countries in Western Europe. You had terrorist attacks in France, now very recently in Belgium. And then you had the problems in Germany over New Year's with the allegations that refugees in Cologne committed mass sexual assaults on women there. So all of that then became sort of connected into a narrative that basically portrayed refugees as a major security risk for, in particular, Western European countries. And that then set very well with an already emerging sort of fear-mongering, if you want, of what that means to Western societies and their Judeo-Christian basis. And one narrative that only sort of came up very briefly, but was almost immediately then drowned out again by the sort of growing traction that the security narrative got and that still the humanitarian narrative had, was a narrative that, in my view, was the only one that actually saw refugees, to the extent that you can see anything positive in there, as an opportunity, in particular as an opportunity for countries in Western Europe that sort of suffer an aging crisis in society, where you actually could really see how sort of there was an attempt to see these refugees as something that should be really welcomed into societies like Germany, like Sweden, like France. More recently has also embraced this narrative a little bit, where there's a real opportunity on both sides. So refugees can escape the horrors of the Syrian civil war, and at the same time, it is a very welcome development, or should be seen as a welcome development, to integrate people into Western European societies, both on a temporary basis, but also on a longer-term basis. So the point that I'm trying to make about these narratives is that in many ways, I think the media have quite a responsibility in terms of how they shape the perception of the wider public on these issues. And if the dominant narrative is one that portrays refugees as very critical security risks, then obviously the opportunities that we have for integration are really limited. And increasingly we don't see refugees anymore as individual human beings, humans like us, if you want, sort of me saying that sitting in my office in Birmingham, but rather we see them as a mass of just sort of faceless potential terrorists, and I think that deprives both our own societies of a major opportunity, but also it does terrible injustice to the large, to the overwhelming number of refugees who really don't come to Europe to commit acts of terrorism or abuse our health systems or welfare systems, but who really come because they are trying to escape of what is a horrendous situation in their home country.
Thanks. Andrew, can you talk about this as well, and maybe also specifically from your perspective in how we perceive refugees and the human rights of refugees and
microphone's
oh, sorry. I'm just having a chat with my friend Andrew. I didn't realize you were all here. So my question is, and then Andrew, can you talk about refugees, and particularly from the human rights perspective, and how we perceive refugees, and whether even think about their human rights, rather than just think of them as other?
Sure. Is that on? I've just turned it on. Now it's turned it on. All right. There we go. Whoa. It's such an enormous topic, and trying to prepare for this was just incredibly difficult. This is really the issue of our decade, really of our generation, not just because of it being about the refugees and about that the refugees represent a complete failure of the international community to deal with conflicts in Syria and elsewhere. What it spawned, and what my colleague here was talking about, that it's been conflated with terrorism, it's been conflated with security threats, and now it's really conflated with EU issues as well, whether that the EU is under stress and strain because of refugees issue, and we see a corresponding rise in nationalism, neo-Nazis getting into parliaments. We're seeing just appalling, really appalling kind of spin-off stories of this. I don't blame the journalists on the ground for that. I think there's been an enormous amount of really good reporting from all over Europe and a lot of the rest of the world on the refugee issue. When there's been a lot of reporting that's really tried to humanize refugees, and I think the reporters were on this story and handling it fairly responsibly in most cases, long before the politicians did. I would argue that the politicians still aren't handling it at all responsibly. So the media has actually done a relatively good job in terms of the field reporting. And sometimes it even came from media outlets that you wouldn't necessarily suspect would sort of even be interested in the refugees issue. The Wall Street Journal for example, was one of the first really to go into serious detail on some of the European refugee issues. And I think a lot of people wouldn't have expected them to be kind of so much in the lead, and it was great to see. I mean, they really did some excellent stuff. But there's a big difference between the field reporting, which was generally good, and kind of the political reporting, which got very, very sloppy. And that's where we saw a real problem. It got sloppy because journalists didn't necessarily, or commentators, let's say, because I think we're kind of out of the realm of field reporting, commentators didn't necessarily understand refugee law. They didn't necessarily understand international obligations. They didn't understand the complexity of the EU. They got suckered into nationalist stories and nationalist narratives because, let's face it, there's not really a European media. There's 28 or 29 different national medias, okay? And that's one of the kind of, it's very difficult to get European unity on any issue, let alone something like this, when you don't really have a European media. So I think we have to separate those two aspects out, the field reporting and the political reporting. And so far we haven't really seen enough responsible political reporting, and consequently, I think that really does affect how the political response has been so awful. I mean, the new EU-Turkey deal, you know, illegal, immoral, impractical, and you know, how did we get to this situation? And I think the political reporting, you know, has something to answer for on that.
Well, that leads us very nicely into what Georg was going to talk about, which is I'd like you to start out by talking about with the Hungarian perspective, and then we move to the international perspective, because you have particularly good insight and view into Hungary as a case study and the way things were perceived inside and outside of Hungary. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Thank you. First of all, I have to say I agree perfectly with Andrew that this is an issue we are talking about that is so huge that it's very, very complicated to pack in such a short time that we have. But let me just briefly talk a little bit about Hungary, because Hungary has been always a little bit in the limelight of all what was happening with migrants coming to Europe. When you saw how over last year the informations were coming up, of course we have had this kind of influx into the European Union of migrants very strongly into Italy and Greece for quite a long time, but it was somehow reported as something far away, not directly, let's say, concerning us. They are coming by boats over from Libya, from other countries. There are big problems in Lampedusa, but Lampedusa was very far away. And then suddenly you saw that this kind of wave of migrants was coming closer. There were some difficulties in Greece, at the Greece-Macedonian border. This is quite interesting that this border always has played a very important role, but by the first really demonstrations that were happening at let's say, May, June last year at the border between Greece and Macedonia, people could have taken much more notice about what was approaching for, let's say, other European countries when more migrants would come and move up towards, let's say, the center of Europe, which was mostly their goal to reach. It all, of course, came very intensely in the press when these migrants were arriving in Hungary, which was also quite interesting for us because Greece is a European Union country, and everybody was saying they're arriving now in the European Union by the moment they arrived in Hungary. So we had a lot of migrants arriving at the border, crossing the border. The Hungarian authorities also not too well prepared for what was coming, because I think a lot of people were not able to imagine what was really the effects of what's happening if so many people were arriving. But then, from my perspective as a Red Cross person, also working very actively with the Hungarian Red Cross, was to see how fantastically the Hungarians reacted in providing help, in providing voluntary service, in providing assistance to the migrants arriving in Hungary. And at the same time, we read a lot of reporting about Hungary, that how badly the migrants are treated when they arrive in Hungary, how badly everything works, how miserably the official authorities are treating the migrants, and how complicated the whole situation is. Which was quite interesting, because from our side we saw this incredible this wave of help coming from the side of the Hungarian population, the amount of volunteers who were immediately registering and saying they want to help, they want to assist, they want to do something good. And of course, as more the things were steaming up and the migrants were moving towards Budapest, and you all will remember that we had all of these masses of migrants arriving at the Eastern Railway station in Budapest, with, let's say, with the question, what is going to happen, where are they going to go to, and they were camping there. It was also incredible to see how much help was arriving to support them, but how less was reported about this, let's say, wave of humanitarian aid that was given, and how big the press was only focusing on the critics towards the Hungarian authorities. And then, of course, when everything went on and the discussion started about the fence, then hell broke loose, because everybody was saying the Hungarians are building a fence, and how can they do so? What is their, let's say, why are they doing that? Why are they building this fence? Why the Hungarians tried to put a little bit more of control to see what is happening at their border. I went with Hungary through all the process of Hungary joining the European Union, and I knew how many different, let's say, steps a country has to take when it joins the European Union. It has also to sign a lot of treaties when it becomes a member of Schengen. And in Schengen is also included that you have to control your border, and you have to guarantee to the other Schengen countries that you control your border. And therefore, it was also not only to criticize that Hungary was building up this fence to find out who is coming into the country and who not. And interestingly enough, now I have to see when other countries are building their fence, as it was so much criticized by Hungary doing it, suddenly nobody was using the word fence, everybody was using the word obstacle, widening the doors of the borders to control who is coming in. When Austria was building up its fence, it was called Austria is giving a cry of help, to say that it cannot cope with the issue. When Hungary was doing it, it was a crime against, European reality, open borders. How can they do this? So it was very interesting for us to see in Hungary how let's say, how biased very often the reports were about the situation, what was happening in Hungary. And I feel particularly sorry because when I saw then with the migrants arriving in Germany and the very, very positive reports in Germany about how migrants were received there when they were arriving, and to show how with open arms they were received, they should have also reported about how they were received when they came to Hungary and how many efforts did the people do to receive them and to help and to assist. So it is always a question how reporting shows a picture of the situation in a certain country. But you also wanted to know what it's, let's say, the Red Cross is now doing. Of course, the Red Cross is an organization that has the big advantage that is working in 189 countries, and it is practically in all the countries where, let's say, on the way the migrants are moving up towards Europe, and especially now in Greece, the Red Cross is incredibly active. Of course, as you also, Andrew, mentioned before, we don't know what is going to happen now. We have no clue what is going to happen in the next weeks in Greece. How will be the impact of this treaty with Turkey? So what is going to happen there on the ground? Because it's very difficult to foresee. We have to see how we try to make the collaboration between different national societies of the Red Cross, because we have much stronger national societies, weaker national societies, that they work together. Now for the moment they are trying to put a lot of forces together to be in Greece, to be present there, to help and to assist the migrants on the ground. But this needs a lot of organizational background, and we are working very strongly on that. Thank you.
Before I ask the next question, any comments from either of you? Andrew?
Well, sure. The Hungarian case, just to come back a little bit, I think it's very true that there wasn't enough coverage of what individual Hungarians were doing, and there were small groups of people and even larger groups of individuals who were helping, and that didn't get covered. I think you're absolutely right. We, Human Rights Watch, actually wrote a piece exactly on that, saying, while we very much disagree with the Hungarian government's approach and the conditions that they created in camps and the fences and so on, you cannot blast an entire country, because there are other individuals who are doing other things, and that's not really being seen. So that's something that we noticed as well. But I would say that the Hungarian government's approach to this has been among the worst of the 28. It has been so vociferously nationalistic, and the language has been so, just it's 1526 and the siege of Belgrade, or it's 1683 and the siege of Vienna. It was that kind of language, the language of invasion. And these are not people coming with weapons. These are not people coming, on horseback with scimitars. These are people who are, as you very well know, were fleeing some of the worst horrors. So I think it's very difficult sometimes for international journalists to portray. I mean, obviously, bad news sells better than good news. That's very true. But it's also difficult to kind of say, we get into these discussions of, well, Hungary's doing this and Hungary's doing that. And usually what we mean when we talk like that is the government. The Hungarian government is doing this. Hungarian government is doing that, and we have to be very careful with that language because it's not the whole country, and there are other voices in that country, and they deserve to to be known and have their actions, when they do the right thing, have those actions recognized. And yeah, the comparison of we know we're in a different age now because in 2016 the walls are going up all over Europe, and the contrast to 1989 and the post 1989 situation when the walls came down across Europe, then and in the coming years later, a little bit farther east. I mean, it could not be more stark. I mean, we are in a very different age, and the age is one where people are actually, because of this crisis and its mishandling, it's not a refugee crisis. It's a crisis of confidence in the European Union. It's a crisis of political will. This is not a huge, impossibly huge number of people. Okay, in a European Union that has 500 million people in it, 1 million people is not a lot of people. It really isn't. The absorption capacity of the European Union could handle that. It really could. So, I mean, it's a crisis of our political leaders who are messing this up, who are playing with fear to win votes and playing with hate to win votes. That's what the crisis is. And that's what the political reporting needs to turn to, because it's not a refugee crisis. Sorry.
Can I?
Of course.
Sorry.
There's clap. Let me just say one thing. Our room is completely packed, but there's still people standing. There's a couple of places to sit over here, and if you're game, you can sit on the floor here. We're all friends. So feel free to come in and just sit where you like.
I only have to react a little bit of Hungary being the worst of all the European Union countries. I would kind of refrain from saying that because I can show you so many remarks from politicians from other European Union countries which are very, very negatively. And sometimes also we are fighting with a little problem that the Hungarian language is a very complicated one, and sometimes people have very much difficulties to follow what politicians are saying in the country and what not. The reactions that Hungary was taking, Hungary did take because it was the one, let's say the first one that had to cope with the, let's say the first one was Greece. And it was also Italy. But Hungary was one of the first countries, let's say, being a European Union country, where migrants were arriving in masses. And they had to take a decision of what to do and how to do it. You may criticize what they did, and you may criticize what they did at the end of last year. But you see that a lot of countries are now reacting in a very similar way. And to say only about Hungary that Hungary was, let's say, not correctly behaving is, I would not go for that.
It's definitely now not just Hungary alone. There's no question about that. But also, if you want a good example, oh sorry, go. Sorry. If you want a good example of a good example, you can look at this country, Italy. I mean, Italy, as you rightly said. I mean, this situation was happening in Italy for quite a long time before anybody noticed it. And there's actually a really interesting reason why it changed. And it wasn't just because they're coming into Hungary. It was the actual image, and I think, anyway, you can maybe come in here. The reason I think that the attitude changed from, oh, this is happening in the Mediterranean, it doesn't matter, to, wow, this is happening, is because the images changed from people on boats, which were kind of, to Central Europeans, was sort of a little bit difficult to understand, to people on train tracks, which to anybody who knows anything about Central European history and refugees walking along train tracks goes right back to the aftermath of the Second World War and the expulsion of millions from their homes in the immediate years following the Second World War, and all of those memories, particularly in Germany, the expulsion of the ethnic Germans from Central and Eastern parts of Europe back into two Germanys anyway. I think those images were actually really, that's what sort of changed the mood, at least in Germany, in a sense, and kind of brought it home, like, oh wow, this actually feels like something we recognize now. I don't know, maybe.
Steph, anything to add?
No, I would very much agree with that, and it's also interesting, sort of. I mean, I am German. I mean, the accent gives it away, but also I've been living in the UK now for 20 years, and I still follow German media, and I sort of live with British media. And it was a very different perspective that you got from both of those. I mean, for Britain, I mean, it was really, really very, very far away because it's, I mean, by the time you get from Syria to the UK, I mean, that's, you can't just walk along train tracks, let's put it like that. And I mean, what was really making headlines, if you want, in the UK was what the UK government did was sort of from the outset try to limit the number of refugees that the UK was willing to take in. But then what the UK actually did and had been doing for quite some time was invest quite significantly in improving conditions regionally. So I think until about a year or a year and a half ago, the UK government of all the individual states in Europe was the largest donor to the refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. Now, I mean, we can all have different views of how good that is, and should we be doing that? Should we be leaving people there, or should we sort of help facilitate their exit from what is overall a very volatile region, of course. But it's really, I mean, distance really matters. I mean, proximity to the actual, whatever we want to call the situation, really makes a difference, and that also creates these difficulties that we have at the political institutional level within the EU. I mean, a country like Portugal or Spain has a very different perspective on that than, say, Ireland, the UK, Sweden, Finland, Poland. I mean, everybody has very different priorities, and not every country necessarily sees the influx of refugees as high on their agenda as another, and that then creates this problem. Well, if you sit in Brussels, what are we focusing on first today? Is it Ukraine? Is it Syria? Is it Iran? Is it North Korea? Is it Russia? So you get this overlay of lots and lots of different issues with basically 28 countries, each having their own national interests at heart, which then, and I don't want to be an apologist for the poor response of the EU that the EU actually has had, but I think we also need to bear in mind that, I mean, as Andrew just said, 1 million people, it shouldn't really be that much of a problem, and clearly for some countries it is not. And then if the priorities are somewhere else, it is much more difficult to actually negotiate sort of something that is a really effective response. So I think from that perspective, there are added complexities here where I think it's not necessarily always that easy to say, well, it's all the politicians' fault. I think then we also need to be more specific and say, well, who actually really messed it up, or who doesn't contribute as much as they could or should.
So, okay, really fast.
Really fast. We are talking, there's also something we have to bear in mind. We are always talking about the 500 million and the 1 million that is easy to handle for this 500 million. The problem is that this 1 million for the moment are not going in the 500 million territory. They're going in a much smaller territory because they have very few countries they have selected to where they want to go to. So that is also something where we talk very often about, 500 million. It's not the 500 million, because when you tell the migrants you will be sent to, you should go to Latvia or to Ireland or to Portugal, they're saying, no, we're going to Germany. And therefore, it is a little bit an argument. Sometimes it's used 500 million, 1 million. It is not 500 million.
Good. Again, there are some seats that are, one sec, there are seats that have opened up, so if you want to sit, there's one in the front and a couple in the back. I have a couple of questions that have been tweeted to me, and there are some questions in the room. So let me just ask one, and we'll do sort of a quick fire round. You've talked about the political reporting. One of the things that I wrote about a couple of months ago, actually, is, and that I thought would get picked up more, but actually hasn't, was around the role of business. So the expectation that governments would be involved in the solution, that NGOs would be involved with the solution, but actually, what is the role of business, and shouldn't business be involved early on in decision making? Because accommodations within the economic system would need to be made and addressed for integrating refugees quickly and easily. There have been some good efforts that have been working on. A guy named Mike Butcher started Techfugees, which is gathering together technology firms to think about creative solutions and also training for refugees. I just wonder if anyone has anything to say about, sort of the larger solution, the long-term solution, the whole solution we need to be thinking of, because it just doesn't seem as if we're asking everybody who needs to have their minds in the process involved in the process.
Can I say one sentence?
Yep.
But I think, you sort of the answer to your question is in the question. There needs to be a comprehensive solution. So there's only so much each of these individual components can do. And George and we had a discussion about this last night. Business, for example, can only go so far in terms of hiring refugees if you have very restrictive labor laws in place. So these labor laws need to change. They need to be changed by politicians, but a lot of the politicians who would need to change them are now so wedded to this discourse that, these people come here to exploit our welfare system, take away our jobs, this, that, and the other, that it is also then from that perspective, if you are in it to win votes, you're not going to vote for a relaxation of labor laws, for example. So I think what was missed at the beginning is sort of to use this initial very positive response that sort of individual citizens had to refugees coming in, sort of use that momentum and really translate it into this kind of comprehensive approach where everybody pulls in the same direction and where the goodwill that business, I think to a large extent still has, would actually have been given sort of a proper legislative basis on the grounds of which you could then actually have moved forward and done much more for sort of real integration of the people coming to the various countries in the EU.
I just wanted to say, yes, it's all lying in the legal framework that is for the businesses, because, for example, in Germany you have the so-called ISO certificates. So if you have some owners of small and medium-sized enterprises who say we want to accept some migrants to work for us, but they don't have no ISO certificate, they put their own company in jeopardy. Because if they have a checking on who's working for them and somebody's working there without an ISO certificate, they are losing it and they are bringing their whole enterprise into danger. So it's, I think the business is ready to do a lot of things, and I think the business is very well prepared to do this. The only thing that is missing is the legal background, and that is where you have to work on.
The German Business Association jumped in very quickly on this issue, whereas you didn't hear a word out of the UK. And that was the difficulty.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're all definitely in agreement on this one. There's that we would like to see the business community and more member states take this up, find solutions in hand with government, and I have to say hand in hand with the labor unions as well. Mm-hmm. Extremely important to get the labor unions on side with this, because some of their members will be feeling this as a threat to their jobs. Oh, they're just going to come in and whatever, reduce wages overall, and so on. So they need to be brought in, and I don't think it's not impossible kind of rocket science brain surgery. It just means getting people in the room and discussing these issues and working it through.
I just think for politicians, they didn't think automatically who else should be in the room besides us, and didn't actually
I agree.
And also didn't demand that business step up as well, because business has more responsibility than ever, and we've privatized so many things, but with that control comes responsibility. Okay, I've got about 15 questions on Twitter. I've got some questions in the room, so we're really going to do quick fire. Someone over here had a question. If you want to say your name, you can, but you don't have to.
Okay, I'm Marcel Chouaro. I'm from Syria. So it's interesting to hear that.
Good.
The problem starts with the refugee term. The refugee category that fits in, everyone fits some criteria to like. And then I started to hear last year, you don't look like a Syrian. And I didn't know what a Syrian looks like. And then the opposite. Look, she's a Syrian with an MA. She's a Syrian without hijab. Look, let's market this. Maybe others see that they look like us. The problem starts with this categorizing. We should break that. There is 23 million Syrians. We don't look alike. We don't act alike. We don't think alike. This is the first problem. The other part is everyone is talking about it as hurricane hit Syria and people are fleeing. So let's deal with it. Without dealing with the roots of the story, we're gonna keep coming. Yeah, you can build fences, others can build fences, and we can compete who can build better fences. But in 2016, people would find a way to arrive. Yeah, they're gonna die on the road, they're gonna bother us by media picture, but they're gonna find a way to arrive. The third part of this story is how we're gonna sit and discuss the end of it. Directly the end of it, not how like accept more. The third point I wanted to say is how Syrian now in defensive mood. When Brussels attacks happened, when it is not a Syrian, everyone says, yes, it's not a Syrian, thanks God. No one here in the room feels guilty because we have foreign fighters in our country, but we are feeling guilty if a small Syrian steals something. We are in defensive mood all the time. And this should stop because it's creating two words. I don't want to believe in two words, but right now there is two words. In our side, the media saying, Cameron said he's going to take 15,000 only. Someone entered the camp and burned it. This is our side of the story. And the other side of the story is refugees did that, refugees did that. Prizes to refugees, as we like, whenever we do anything small, good, someone gets surprised and give us a prize for it. So in the sides, we are creating two words. And without addressing, and I wanted to hear the word Islamophobic in this panel, without addressing Islamophobic clearly, we won't go anywhere. I'm here in the room, there is a Christian symbols in it, and no one is feeling threatened. But if it was the opposite, people will feel threatened. So we should ask ourselves our part of the deal, because I'm not a Muslim, our part of the deal, before asking others their part of the deal. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew's going to say something?
Yeah, sorry, I think that's fantastic. First of all, I don't think there's a person in this room or watching this live or following it on Twitter who would disagree with the fact that the problem is in Syria. It's the problem that the international community has dropped the ball in dealing with that problem right from the very beginning. You know, when a regime responds to protesters in the streets by shooting them, that's a wake-up signal, that things are going wrong. And I knew experts who worked in government and even experts who worked at think tanks and NGOs who even at that point said, oh, we'll never have a civil war in Syria. Assad's got the whole place locked down; it'll be fine. I mean, those were the experts. That's what the experts said. So I think maybe we shouldn't sometimes listen to the experts. But I just want to get to the look like us and this Islamophobia, because that's sort of this spin-off story where we've conflated a whole bunch of things, and Islamophobia is real, and it's extremely troubling in Europe now, and it's as troubling as when we saw acts against Roma, and long in the past we saw attacks on other minorities, and this is just, if you read some of the people who respond to my Twitter feed sometimes, I mean it's pretty shocking.
Yeah. George, you wanted to?
Just one sentence. I'll be very short. I think what is very, very important is that this Islamophobia is also very much, let's say, strengthened by the name of Islamic State, using always again Islamic State as a terrorist organization. Stop calling Islamic State IS, call it Daesh, and take this element out, because this is something that is making a huge damage to Islam and to everybody connected there.
Or just call them rapists and mass murderers.
Perfect.
That would be
no
fine
problem.
with me.
Yeah.
Good. I'm going to take a couple questions that have been tweeted to me. Lena asks, can your panelists address citizen journalism and/or reporting by refugees as drivers of shifting toxic narratives? Anybody? Citizen journalists? Stefan Wolf? Or just, it was a good question.
I think that's an important part of the story, but I think the problem is to get traction in the wider media discourse. And I mean, what Andrew said in the beginning, sort of the difference between the field reporting and the political commentary. I think the political commentary, wrong as it may be on many occasions, still has far more traction than a lot of the field reporting. I mean, the field reporting, I think, every once in a while sort of crops up, and you have a picture that is really traumatizing of a young Syrian boy drowning at the beaches of Greece or Italy or wherever it was. And I mean, these are sort of these these moments where it all becomes clear to us how tragic it is, but then you turn the page and you have lots and lots of commentary that sort of looks at it from a very different perspective, nationalizes it, drags it into all kinds of national politics. I mean, the amount of Brexit contamination that we have in the UK about this now.
It's shocking.
It's shocking is a good word for it. So I think in that sense there is, as much as I would love to sort of say, well, citizen journalism, that's coming to the rescue, that's sort of the white knight that we need. I'm much more of a cynic about that, and I really don't see the kind of people who, in a sense, really need to have their minds opened of what this all is all about, engage with the kind of citizen journalism that actually sort of brings more of a, basically is a reality check that even a lot of the political commentators could do.
But I think it's, I mean, but it's important not to conflate two different things, which is citizen journalists by refugees themselves telling their own stories and trying to share their ideas, their thoughts, versus sort of, somebody else asked a question about toxic narratives and hate speech and so on. And I think you can't, it's important, I think there is something to be said, and somebody else asked why aren't there any refugees on the panel. I think there is a really good point to that, and about how we have to make sure that people are able to tell their own stories. Or this morning we were at a panel and they showed the virtual reality reporting from the New York Times about the experiences of 4 refugee children. And so that people begin to get a better understanding of what that is really like versus second-hand or third-hand information. So I think there is room for all of that different kinds of reporting, as long as we understand that each one comes with their own perspective. There are a lot of questions in the room. I'm going to ask the questions to be short, and I'm going to ask the answers to be short, because we have it's wonderful, the interest, but I want to make sure we get lots in it. Let me take them one at a time first. Please.
Andrew, you were talking about the crisis is, our politicians are playing with fear. We're talking about how the media is dealing with this issue, but there is a part that is, there is fear in society, at least in Germany, and how will you consider that we will report on that? But because there are clear facts that population, like in Sachsen and Clausewitz, where refugees were received with a crowd of like really angry Germans who didn't want the refugees there. So how do you see that part of that fear that has to be reported somehow?
Well, I think there are individual actions that happen that show that fear when it turns into hate. I think maybe it comes more from the political reporting that we talked about. We're trying just this distinction between some of the political reporting or political commentary and the field reporting. You know, I think it's possible for journalists to look at the language that politicians are using and try to analyze that from a perspective, you know, what are they actually trying to signal with this kind of stuff? And then just from the field reporting, look, when an asylum center gets bombed or attacked or firebombed or people get attacked, you know, that needs to be reported. And it doesn't just need to be reported in the back pages. And in Germany, you know, there's a lot of people who are outraged at that, rightly so. And that's not a story that doesn't sell newspapers. That sells newspapers, you know, if that's the intention.
We have 10 more minutes left, and I want to make sure to get in as many questions as possible. So, and you need a mic to ask a question. So maybe we'll take 2 questions from here and then here. Yep.
Thank you. I live in Budapest, and I just wanted to push back on the narrative from the government side, and I'm actually quite concerned about what I'm hearing is a misappropriation of all the incredible amount of work that was done by, that you rightly credit, the volunteers and the activists and the people on the ground, of which I was one of many Hungarian residents doing a lot of this work and support. But the reason all that happened was it was in the absolute absence, the complete failure, absence, and conscious dismissal of the choices of the government to not do anything. And so I think the criticism was criticism of the government, and I think that was absolutely fair and appropriate. And while there should have been more stories about the volunteering that was going on, to conflate those two and see the volunteer responses as a success story for Hungary, I would say it's a success of the people of Hungary, but in the face of a failure of the government. And I think we have these instances that I won't go into in the name of time, but even if they're one-off incidences, there was reporting of a number of journalists that were beaten at the border by Hungarian police trying to cover some of the encampments along the border that was criticized heavily by the OSCE, an environment in which this took place of months prior to the crisis coming to a head. Apologies for the word crisis, but this all coming to a head in Budapest, where you had months of government campaign, of an anti-immigration billboard campaign that was nasty and mean-spirited and xenophobic. And if you look at the domestic coverage of refugees and of all this movement of people, it was very hostile, and a lot of this is government-supported media. So I think it's just important that we distinguish that, and I just wanted to push back on that narrative a bit. Thank you.
Okay, while you pass it, you can answer quickly.
I will answer very quickly. You're right, of course, a lot of things went wrong, and I'm not going to defend this here because a lot of things didn't work. That everything went wrong is not right, because we have had, as the Red Cross, and there I have really direct insight, we had access to a lot of places, registration places, camps in Hungary, where others just were not allowed to move in. So we were there, and we were working there on the ground. And I see that there was a very good collaboration also with the authorities. Yes, sometimes the authorities was not working very well, but there were other cases where the authority did their utmost best to cope with the situation. That was overwhelming for them. And that was absolutely, they were not prepared for what was coming and what was hitting them. But they were trying to use also the civil society, and in this case the Red Cross, to do their work and to perform in these camps, and we had the possibility to do a lot of good there.
Good.
Yeah.
Please.
Can you compare, please?
I can't hear you.
Can you compare Europe's answer to European refugees in the early 90s during the war in ex-Yugoslavia and towards today's non-European refugees?
Stefan, do you have anything? Or do you? Yeah.
Because back then we had in Europe, it was also a lot of refugees, right?
I don't know. I think the numbers, I mean, compared to the Yugoslav wars, I think the numbers of refugees we're talking about at this point, at this stage of the game for Syria, are higher. I think the initial response to the Yugoslav war was, and the refugees that came from it, Europe was very slow to react, and we're going back a long way. Europe was very slow to react, but then, eventually, that process got better. But you weren't talking about the overall numbers. I think that you're talking as from Syria. I mean, I find it kind of more interesting to talk about, going back, because some of the countries, I'm going to lay off Hungary for a minute because we've done Hungary enough, in a sense, and to give you a break.
I invited him here and see what
to give you a break. But I'll go after the Czechs, because it's so the Czech Republic is a country. I know. So the Czech Republic and there's no one here to defend them. No. But it's a country I know very well, and their response is quite shocking when you compare it to 1968. When Czech and Slovak refugees left the country because of the Soviet invasion, and they were first welcomed by the thousands in Germany, Austria, and other places, and then there were relocation schemes where they ended up in Canada and other places. And I mean, we could go to Hungary in '56 if you want, but there are times when these countries like the Czech Republic needed help, and they found it, and now the response from the Czechs, the Czech government has been really quite damaging, and the Islamophobia out of the mouth of the Czech president Miloš Zeman is appalling. I mean, it's the worst kind of inciting hate speech there is. So I think a lot of the comparisons are interesting to look at, but how is it just simply like this issue of identity? Or do we don't count these people as European, and we count these other people as European, or something like that? Because I'll tell you, when the Yugoslav wars hit, a lot of Western Europeans didn't want to count Bosnians as Europeans. They didn't.
Almost 1 million Bosnians left Bosnia during the war.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they were high. That's true.
We've got about 2 minutes. Steph, was there anything you wanted to add or no? Good. Well, one of the questions that's come in, and as a form of wrap up, is from Kate saying that most of the people in the room agree with much of what has been said. How do we get the message of responsibility to other parts of the media? I mean, and it's a nice question. I think, first of all, I think the conversation has to keep going. And second of all, if you've enjoyed the session, it's been taped. I hope that you'll share it, tweet it, Facebook it, send it to colleagues who weren't able to attend. You can find the three of us, not that I'm very useful on this topic, all on Twitter. You're at Steph Wolf. You're
A stroll on it. Just put it in
yeah, you don't use Twitter. You can ask me and I'll ask him. I'm sure he'll answer me. I do think that it's a conversation that we need to continue having. Somebody else asked, how do we get the voices of more Syrians and refugees themselves and students? I think we have to make sure that we ask them and to encourage that dialogue and look for and demand more conversations, political reporting, business reporting, and find new and creative ways of talking about these things. And of course, we can continue the conversation online. And for those who were watching on the live stream, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for all of your questions. They were exceptional and much better than anything I could have come up with. I hope that you found this session useful. I guess we can stick around for a little while longer, maybe outside if you want to talk individually to our panelists. And otherwise, thank you so much for your incredible response and this overfilled room. It really means a lot.
Thank you.